Kruger here, and you're listening to Mike the Birdman Dodd and the rest of the crew this week in Geek.net.
And now it's time for another special feature.
There's a legend round here. A killer buried, but not dead. A curse on Crystal Lake. A death curse. Jason Voorhees' curse. They say he died as a boy, but he keeps coming back. Few have seen him and lived. Some have even tried to stop him. No one can.
Hey guys, what's going on? You are listening to ThisWeekInGeek.net, and I'm your host, Mike the Birdman Dodd. And yet, we are not on the flagship of stupidity. No, we are actually diving into the depths of knowledge and, dare we say, into the dark force of terror as we decide to take a little bit of a deviation from our normal content. Normally, we talk about video games, movies, and television, but as you guys know, you've been fans of the show for years, 13 years and counting, I might add. I am a big fan of the horror genre. I've grown up on Romero, Stephen King. I've know Jason and Freddy as close friends, if you might say, and I've been afraid of Chucky more than once in my life. But I decided to bring back a guest we actually had on about a decade ago, many moons ago. And I wanted to bring him back to talk about the state of horror in the last decade, but also talk about what it takes to be a writer, a producer, and a director in Hollywood, because this guy has such a long history with the horror movie genre, going all the way back to the 90s. And he has a infamous movie to his credit, but he's also done some other fantastic work since then that I think is something you should be checking out, especially if you're a horror aficionado, much like I am. And I want to welcome Daniel Farrands to the show. Now, he's a name you might recognize as the producer, or no, he wrote the screenplay and the story for Halloween Part 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, with the weirdly unaging Paul Rudd. And he's also done some of the documentaries involving some of our favorite horror movie characters, such as Crystal Lake Memories, which focuses on the Friday the 13th franchise, and Never Sleep Again, the Elm Street Legacy, featuring, of course, Freddy Krueger. So, Daniel, welcome back to the show after almost 10 years.
It's hard to believe that. Is that really true? That it's 10 years since we...
Yeah.
Wow.
We
I laugh, but that's crazy.
Yeah, it's so nuts to think it's been so long, and then we've been Facebook friends for that long. I mean, I remember.
Right? Yeah, it's gone too fast, but I'm glad to be back. Thanks for. We'll have to do this once a decade. Maybe next time I'll be closer to my wheelchair years. Let's hope not.
But yeah, I mean, like, it's been fantastic to kind of get you back, just because the horror genre has changed so much. Because I remember when I started talking with you back then, you had just finished Elm Street Legacy. Yeah. I just met Heather Langenkamp at Fan Expo, and things were changing in the horror genre. We were starting to see a lot more low budget indie horror titles, and a lot of them were relying, I'd say, fairly heavily on CG effects, but you'd have more people that want to do more kind of practical effects. So one of the things I wanted to get your perspective on, as a person who's involved in the genre in multiple ways, how have things changed from 2010 to 2020 in your opinion?
Yeah, I kind of look at this past decade as kind of like the decade of Blumhouse, like who kind of came out, out of nowhere and sort of owned the genre in a major way. So, and I think, and having worked with Blumhouse on a film that we can or cannot discuss to you, it's interesting. They kind of resurrected the low budget indie model of filmmaking with, the Paranormal Activity films initially, and then they did Insidious after that, and Sinister. There was this whole kind of like a lineup of these films that started to come about, and I want to say, even I can't remember did Hostel come before or after, somewhere in that area. And so yeah, it is really interesting that there was this bit of a renaissance in the last 10 years, and these, what I think in the 80s might have been considered kind of low rent horror films have kind of become a little more mainstream. Not that Blumhouse has had, not every film has been a hit, but they just have kind of turned into this a little bit of a factory in terms of being able to put these movies out and doing them at a certain level. And interestingly, also just attracting bigger names. And I think that's one of the interesting things about it. And maybe that began with, going back to the 90s with Scream, where Wes Craven, who, in these years we've sadly lost, was able to attract, Drew Barrymore and, Courtney Cox and, this young kind of cool group of young actors to populate the film. So, yeah, I think that might be the sea change a bit is I kind of think this past decade is the decade of the Blumhouse phenomena. So
when you
and
look,
not to say that that's the only thing, but I think that has spurred on a whole bunch of other, indie films. And, we have the A24 films now. And I think in art, I feel like there's more of an art house feeling to a lot of these movies that have come our way, like The Lighthouse and, Hereditary and The Babadook. And, there's been these really interesting movies that have come out. And I just feel like people are challenging the genre a little bit more.
Absolutely. I mean, especially now since we're moving away from monster movies, although they are still there. You don't see as many of them
Sure.
as you used to.
Right.
But at least you're seeing more practical effects. And as you mentioned, there are more art house movies. One of the movies I saw recently was Color Out of Space
Right.
by Richard Stanley. And
Sure.
a movie I didn't expect to be actually made, because Lovecraft is obviously a big influence for a lot of filmmakers.
Right.
But how many of his stories are actually filmable unless you have like $100 million budget?
Yeah, exactly right. I think that's where, Stewart got so creative, and Stuart Gordon in his career, who, just, took some of those Lovecraft stories and was able to make them and pull them off on very modest budgets. But yeah, now I think with the audience, I think the expectations are higher. Now we live in this world. Every movie seems to be like a tentpole, adaptation, something from the Marvel universe. And I just feel like in a way, it's great because, again, like I said, it challenges technically, us to do better. But on the other hand, I feel like there's also an unrealistic expectation that every movie is going to rise to the technical heights of, these extravaganzas, these big studio tentpole movies. So,
do you think we'll ever have the cultural phenomenon of having the big horror tentpoles again? I mean, like, we have had fairly big directors like Jordan Peele and his selection of horror movies become fairly popular. But I'm talking, do you think we'll ever see the rise of a Freddy again, Jason? Because the last Child's Play movie that came out in 2019 was expected to be this big return to the franchise, but ultimately it was kind of a disappointment.
Yeah, but I was actually surprised that it did as well as it did. I think there was initially that, horror fans are the best because they're the most loyal. They're not the best because they're so brutally honest sometimes, and I think they, in this world that we live in of, just everything is just spoiled. I hate to say it, but, just everything is talked about before it's even made. And I feel like there was a lot of flack against that Child's Play redo, or whatever you want to call it, because it wasn't the initial, it wasn't a sequel to the ongoing series. And, I know my friend Don Mancini, who created Chucky, was not too pleased that they went back and redid it. But actually thought it was sort of inventive. Can't say I loved it, but I thought they did a lot for a modest budget. And I think the movie performed better than, honestly, they expected it to.
I think one of the problems with Child's Play, and this will be kind of lead into my kind of next question, is Mark Hamill is a fantastic actor. I mean, he's done the Joker, he's Luke Skywalker, etc. But him being cast as Chucky, he has to compare to Brad Dourif, and you look back at other characters like Freddy Krueger as Robert Englund, Kane Hodder as Jason. Where does, like, for these franchises that have these big iconic villains and the roles get recast. What does that mean for these big horror franchises that do want to do a resurgence? Because I know there's plans. I think it was Deadline reported this week that the Hellraiser reboots moving forward.
Yep, that's true. Listen, I think these stories are immortal in the sense of, they are my generations, and I don't know how old you are, but your generations, Wolfman, Frankenstein, Dracula, they represent that. So, and those characters have never really gone away. So, I think these characters will just continue to evolve and be reinvented for the next, crop of teenagers. And I think that's inevitable. I mean, I think the success of the last Halloween, remake or sequel or semi-sequel was proof that there's interest in these characters and that they're going to keep, milking them. I think the difficult one to recast is somebody like Robert in Nightmare, because and
he was such a personality for us.
Yeah,
right?
And I think that's the difference is, obviously playing Michael Myers, playing Jason come with their own challenges. It's like you're trying to emote something behind a mask, and all this heavy makeup, and you really have nothing but your body language to relate the character to the audience and to express him. But Freddy is different. He had a very specific personality, the way he walked, the way he talked. Robert owned that character inside and out. In fact, in my documentary, we did a whole section at the beginning of the second movie, part 2, Freddy's Revenge, where they actually did try to recast Robert when they started that, not knowing that it was ever going to become a franchise, of course, in those days, but also that he had made the character his own even at that point. So they had shot a couple scenes, I want to say. I think the scene in the shower, and you see this kind of lumbering, weird-looking stuntman come out dressed as Freddy, and it's kind of a shadowy figure, but that's not Robert. And I think after they saw the dailies, they said, no, this is not going to work. Call him up. Pay him what he wants. I think that was the issue. I think there was a bit of a debate on what his salary would be for that second film. And then he came back and has been with it ever since. And I think people have in a weird way like fallen in love with that character, and strange as it may sound, but also Robert is that character. So I think that's the one that is a little bit different. In terms of Chucky, obviously it's a puppet, it's a little doll. The voice coming out of it has to be specific, and I think Brad certainly owned that for a long time. But I think Mark rose to the occasion in that. I thought he did a pretty good job, of making it his own, but also not changing it up too much.
Yeah, it was something different. It was I'm trying to figure out the right phrase I'd use here. Maybe innocently menacing.
Right.
Although hearing Luke Skywalker call someone Dick Cheese was totally out there. Didn't see
you're
that
not supposed to be thinking that's Luke Skywalker. That's the too many things. But I think again the idea is that these characters will stay with us for many years, generations to come, and I think we just have to expect that they're going to go on and new and maybe sometimes not the way that we would want them to, but it's a new way for people who are younger than us to appreciate them.
Now, here's a question. So you mentioned the success of the Halloween reboot.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question I'd like to ask you. If budget were no problem and IP license holders were okay with everything, what franchise that's maybe been asleep for a while would you resurrect? And I'll give you something to think about. Okay. If I had to pick one that nobody's touched since the mid '90s at the latest, the Pumpkinhead franchise.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting one. That would be cool. Look, there's a whole bunch of those old titles sort of sitting there, and it's not always the money as much as it is. You have to understand these movies were made a lot of times on shoestring budgets, and they didn't have the best contracts. So there's one film that we attempted to get the rights to, and it just became, and you have to remember too, like these movies were released sometimes by these independent, distribution companies that don't exist anymore. And those rights may or may not have been granted to other companies, but tracking them down is very difficult. And I'm being, sort of like I'm understating it when I say how difficult it is to just sort out the chain of title on some of these things. For example, Tom McLaughlin, the director of Friday the 13th Part 6, one of my favorites, I think a lot of fan favorites. Yep. His film, his first horror film, One Dark Night, has been something that's there's been interest in remaking that for many years. The rights are a disaster. You just cannot find out who inherited them. They changed hands so many times. I mean, even down to like being owned by banks at some point.
Weird.
And no, so that's some of the challenge, so I don't know specifically with Pumpkinheads. You brought that as an example, what that might be. But a lot of times why you don't see the resurrection of some of them is because the chain of title, as they call it, who owns it now, is not clear. And so people just avoid it.
Wow, that's so unfortunate too.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess you just can't go, well, I'm just going to make it anyway and see who sues me.
Well, there's talk about that too. Tom and I had talked about wondering, like, well, why don't we just go do it and see who comes out of the woodwork? We'll pay them some money if they have some legitimate legal claim to it. But then it's getting somebody to write, $1 million check to say, go make that movie. And sure, if I get sued, come out. Nobody's going to take that risk.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difficulty.
So if you could do it and you could secure whatever rights you possibly could, mm-hmm. What is the Daniel Farrands movie you're going to resurrect? What franchise?
I know this is a little obvious, but I mean, Friday the 13th Part 13. I mean, I have to make that. So, and talk about a legal jumbled mess right now that franchise is in.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I think the fate of Jason has been in question for that last several years. And I think, each party is holding firm to his side of the argument. I understand it, but, I think it's just really pissed off a lot of fans. We've just had this weird proliferation of these fan films because I think the fan base is getting so desperate for a new movie. They're like, fuck it, we'll just go make our own. So we've just seen tons of them. I've lost track of the number of, Indiegogo, whatever campaigns for the next Friday the 13th fan film. But anyway, in answer to your question, it would be like a life dream come true for me to make the 13th movie of the franchise, which this one would be.
Yeah, that would be definitely... Well, it would be the most iconic, and it would be mm-hmm. a return from the 2009 movie.
Which I think needs to all go away. I mean, that's just my feeling. I just don't think I just don't feel like tonally that was a Friday the 13th movie. It was just shot like a chainsaw movie, and it just didn't feel to me like they went out of their way to pay. I mean, listen, I don't think every movie should be fan service, but I feel like you need to acknowledge it, and you need to make it part of that space. And I just felt like the music and everything just felt, there's this great, performance by Derek Mears as Jason and all of that, but I just I watched it. I'm like, this is not a Friday the 13th. It's just the guy with a hockey mask running around.
One of my favorite moments out of that movie, and I laughed hysterically in the theater and I had everybody stare at me, is where Jason is chasing Jared Padalecki and whoever else down these tunnels, and there's these lights. And right. I leaned over to my friend Pierce at the time, mm-hmm. and I said, when did Jason find time to go to Home Depot? Because he's a master electrician.
Yeah, he just lined them all up and he got his little tea lights down there, and it was this weird amalgamation of like of Chainsaw and My Bloody Valentine, and just sort of took all these weird ideas that just didn't feel like I was at the Crystal Lake that I knew and loved. And it kind of goes right to what you were saying before about how they've changed. It's whether it's Mark Hamill playing Chucky or another actor trying to play Freddy, in this case, it wasn't the actor playing Jason. It was the people that made the movie just didn't seem to understand they were making Friday the 13th.
Well, hopefully you will get your wish somehow, someday.
You never know.
Maybe some anonymous billionaire can pay off somebody who owns the rights and it's like, here, just take this money and fuck off.
I know. I think it's a bigger legal matter though. And I think the next step is if the case isn't decided.
I think it's this year, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it'll be this year, but again, depending on what's going on in the world right now, when courts can reconvene, it should be this year. But if it doesn't, if the thing isn't resolved to everyone's satisfaction, it could actually go to the Supreme Court.
Oh wow!
It's that big of a decision. So we hope for the best, but it's just it's unfortunate that I think that these rights issues become bigger than the fans need to see another movie or immerse themselves in another film. And, I feel like the makers of that need to figure it out and deliver the goods, because I think the fans have waited long enough.
So you had mentioned fan films and whatnot, and that kind of leads me down my next avenue of questioning. So there's a lot of people who want to make movies, and they're doing it on YouTube, they're doing it on Indiegogo, they're doing it across a variety of different digital platforms and whatnot. So how does somebody, because your path is probably very different than people that are coming up now, but how does someone begin to break in to the horror genre, either as a writer, a producer, or a director, which I know you have experience with all three?
Gosh, yes. I mean, my experience at the time I got that break, world was very different. I don't think at the time we didn't have AOL at that juncture. So
CompuServe,
right. And CompuServe, I think those were new, but, or just coming out, but yeah, I mean, now we're in this space of there's so much opportunity. Anybody can make a movie. You just make it with your phone. I mean, the quality that comes off an iPhone or a Galaxy, it's just astounding to me. Yeah, the resolution and the editing software you can do right on your home computer, or sometimes even on your phone, your tablet. I mean, things that were unheard of back in my day. But conversely, I feel like that's a detriment because there's too much now. There are too many people trying to break in, too many people thinking they can do it. A lot of people thinking it's easy, and it's not. What I think people need to do, though, if they want to get noticed, is stop making fan films based on franchises, because nobody's ever going to notice that as like, oh, this guy's really going to, let's hire him to make our next horror film or thriller from A20. People aren't going to respond to that. People, a distinctive voice is what's going to be heard. And I think, like, for example, like the maker of Lights Out, made the short film that gained a lot of attention online and became a big hit as a feature film. Like, that's the rarity, but it's also something that was original. And so I think to stand out, if somebody wants to break in now, you got to be really original and break molds and get attention whatever way you can, because there's just so much content out there. You just want to get eyes on your movie. So how does someone, like, because one of the things I've always had a dream of, and even when I was in school for media, they never really taught us this. How does someone begin to craft? Because like you said, you were a writer. How do you find that original idea and voice to even begin to send out to people to say, hey, I have this cool idea for a scary movie? Like, where do you even start with that? Well, I mean, it starts with your imagination. Every movie starts with a what if. And I think that's where we all, dig in our well of creativity, is with the what if. Sometimes it could be something that strikes you as, whether you're watching another movie or you witness something out in the real world, or have a relationship that, also almost, puts you over the edge. These are the things that, become universal. I think of a movie way back when, like Fatal Attraction. What if you had a one night stand, and what if that person turned out to be a psychopath? I mean, that's the beginning of every movie, is the what if. And so to me, that's the beginning. And you fill that with whatever your imagination leads you to. And hopefully it is something original, not only original, but something that is relatable and kind of universal.
Now, would you recommend a person who is, say, an aspiring writer, do they necessarily need post-secondary? Should they go to college or film school?
That's been the question for years and years. I didn't go to film school. And sometimes I wish I had. On the other hand, I have friends who went to film school and have got student debt that'll last them to the day they die. And they've never gotten a job in the film business. So I think it's whatever works for you, and whatever gets you to where you want to be. So and I think it takes a lot of drive to get into this industry, but it also takes somebody who is likable. Nobody wants to work with crazy people who I think one of the things that, and just from my own experience, when I was young and got the opportunity to pitch Halloween 6, and by the way, the thing that got their attention wasn't my Halloween 6 script. That came later. It was another script, like an original horror script that I'd written, and I got it into the hands of the producer of Halloween 5, who read it and liked it. Oh, I like the writing on this. Why don't you come in? And I, jumped at the chance, of course. So your calling card is that original spec script you get it into the hands of people you want to work with in any way you can. Agents are usually the typical way, but you meet people. Somebody always knows somebody. And in the world of social networking and everything now, the access is so much easier. That things that didn't exist then. But what I will say is the way that new people approach producers sometimes it can be off-putting because they don't know better. And my biggest, bit of advice that I could give somebody who gets an opportunity is be grateful. Don't let them screw you, but be grateful. Play with the team. Don't upset the apple cart too much. Fight for your vision, but don't be aggressive. One of the things that I think impressed Mustafa Akkad, who was the granddaddy of Halloween at the time, and I certainly owe the man my career, was that I went into those meetings and I just was so thrilled to be there. I never once mentioned my agent because I didn't have one. I didn't mention, how much am I getting paid? Like none of that came into any of those conversations. And it came back to me later that's part of the reason I got hired, was because I came in with pure enthusiasm and not, what am I getting? Talk to my people. I didn't play that. When you're new, you have to kind of kiss the brass ring a little bit and show them that you're so eager to do the job, you'll do it for free if you had to. So that's part of it, is just knowing how to play the game, but don't come in like you're a player.
Okay. So what are some of the other things that you've learned that maybe you could share? Because you mentioned you didn't go to film school, but what are some of the techniques that you've learned that are maybe unsung tunes that people maybe need to know? Because putting together a documentary, I did one in college, and that was a monumental effort, and I had help. So how did you pull it off?
Oh, man. Luckily I did have help. My gratitude and my endless, love for that little, very small team of us who just kind of threw caution to the wind and decided to put everything we had on the line to produce the initial one, which was Never Sleep Again, just because it was our love of the series. And we knew that the remake was coming out in about a year, and we're like, let's give, because we knew, you kind of instinctively, we knew things we'd heard. In fact, interestingly, I had sort of a bit of a connection, and I've never really talked about, but Kyle Gallner, who was in the cast of the remake, he had starred in a movie I produced called The Haunting in Connecticut right around that time. And all reports were from Kyle was that the set was like a 3-ring circus. It was a disaster. Like they were just throwing dialogue at the actors, and nothing was rehearsed. They didn't know what they were doing. The script was changing every day. It was so knowing what I knew, I was like, yeah, I don't think this movie's going to be good. so we kind of grouped together, myself and Andrew Cash and Buzz Wallach, Tommy Hudson, and a number of other people who really lent their time and talent to just doing what we needed to do to get it done. But yeah, documentary making, man, is so hard. I argue to this day it's harder than making a feature film. It just is. So
yeah, Yeah,
and how I did it, I don't know. It's
Yeah.
just like it was like by the seat of our pants. We didn't really have money. We had some relationships. Like Tommy Hudson, who was our producer and writer. He was many, many years friends with Heather Langenkamp, and so he was able to secure Heather's involvement. And because Heather did it, she could make a couple calls. She called Wes. She called, Amanda Wiss. She called the people in her circle of Elm Street alum that she was able to get them to, okay, if Heather's doing it, we'll do it. So that was the first step on that one. But I don't know if we didn't have that access, if we could have done the show. I think it would have been, maybe we could have, but it wouldn't have been as good. We would have probably gotten some people, but not the number of people we did get. So, but it was an odyssey and it was painful. It was funny too, because I remember the editing process just seemed so endless.
So if I recall correctly, Daniel, I think Elm Street Legacy was 5.5 hours?
That one was not. It was, I hate to disappoint, but I think it was around 4 hours.
Okay, so 4 hours.
The Friday the 13th, because that wasn't painful enough. Let's do Friday the 13th and make it 7 hours. So, yeah, I think during that period, for some reason, I must have been sort of masochistic. I was like a glutton for punishment at that time in my life. I don't know what was going on with me, but no, really, in seriousness, we just wanted to make the kind of show that as fans we'd want to see. We were kind of sick of, we had done another one. I had done another one called His Name Was Jason, which I don't really talk about.
I own that one.
I love it too. Just, no. And the reason I don't love it is because it was just, it was cut to the quick, there was no substance. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's like hours and hours of great material here. And we're like having to wheedle this down to 90 minutes. I feel cheated. This isn't what I signed up for.
I can see that. Yeah.
So, fine, it's kind of fluff piece, whatever. And, there were some cool parts to it. But at the end of the day, I just felt like it wasn't the thing I signed up that I really wanted to make. And I was involved. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Crystal Lake Memories book. So obviously, Crystal Lake, the documentary was based on that. I was the editor and publisher of that book with Peter. So I was there every day through the process of creating that book with him. Except he did the lion's share of all the work, not to take that away from him. It was his idea. It was his baby. He created it, wrote it. I just assisted in the process in a very detailed way. Edited every word of it, helped launch it, helped pay for the publication of it. So all of that book was like a bit of our baby. And so when the opportunity came to kind of revisit Friday the 13th, I had also in the interim, Paramount had brought me in. There was a couple of years there where like Friday the 13th became my entire existence. But Paramount had contacted me directly, or the producers of these special editions. By the time I got to part 4, they're like, yeah, we really need somebody who understands these movies. I think they'd done special editions of 1 through 3 and they weren't great. And so they heard of me and through a mutual friend and called me in. And so I produced all the special features for 4 through 8, which went really well and people loved. And we found all this rare stuff and lost footage and that was great. And it was right after that we went right into Elm Street. Pretty much the same team of us that did those special features for Friday the 13th. So that's how that all began. And then after that, it wasn't long, maybe a year or so. Maybe it was longer. I'm trying to remember. Like between 2010 and 2012, we went. I said, "Listen, why don't we do the version of Friday the 13th that we didn't get to do with His Name Was Jason, and take that footage and combine it with new interviews, people we didn't get the first time around, cut out all the fluff, and do it right." And so, in a way, Crystal Lake Memories, the documentary, was sort of my making up for what I felt like was a lacking experience with the first one.
I gotta say, it was His Name Is Jason. I remember getting it for review, which I want to say was from Anchor Bay or Stars.
It was. You're right.
And I was so excited because I'd never seen a documentary done like this before on a horror movie series. At that time, I was just getting into media school, and documentaries to me were like Michael Moore or
Right.
Nat or Nat
Right.
Geo, right? It was
Yep.
something so different and so radical. So by the time I
Right.
talked to you about Elm Street and then seeing Friday the 13th years later, I didn't know you could make documentaries about anything, and I was always so fascinated by it.
We didn't know either. We just went and did it. So I think that's part of it. We just didn't know any different. You know, like when Peter started the book, you have to understand nobody had done a book, and he'd been rejected by pretty much every major publisher. He had a couple offers from publishers saying, well, you know, maybe we could do like a little paperback and, you know, maybe one for each movie. And, you know, it just felt cheesy, and they were treating it like these movies were kind of not important. And these movies were important to him, to me, to guys like you, and to all these fans around the world. And they didn't understand that. We as fans did get it. And we're like, well, let's just make what we want to see. And so we said, fuck the publishers, we'll just publish it ourselves. And then cut to, you know, whatever number of years later it was, we got to the documentary, like six or 7 years later. And I said, fuck it, you know what? We don't need Stars or Anchor Bay or anybody to finance this. We'll do it like we did with Elm Street. We'll put all our time and talent, and then we'll own it at the end, and we'll pay for it that way. You know, we basically broke even on the thing, but it paid for itself over. And that's what was cool about it, was that we invested our time and our talent, and, you know, all of that would have cost money in the real world, but none of us got paid while we were doing it. So that's kind of how it ended up.
So when you finished both of these documentaries, and we're just going to begin to kind of wind this up.
Sure.
Some of the people you've talked to during both of these are no longer with us anymore. What are some of the best memories you have of both of these movies, or across your career, of people who have maybe passed on? 'Cause I know you've mentioned Stuart Gordon, for example, was a friend of yours. And if you're willing to share, I'd be really curious to hear, what are some of the cool memories from the horror world that I've never heard before?
I mean, things with Stuart, I mean, I can't overestimate just what a special person he was, and what a influence he was to me. And it's, you know, losing him, especially at the beginning of this, you know, worldwide pandemic, and not really being able to express my loss. And I think a lot of his friends and family feel the same way, is very difficult. You know, I remember him coming to when I first bought a house, and you know, Stuart was the first one to show up to the housewarming party with the Jewish bread, and I'm not Jewish, but he's like, "This is good luck for your new home." So he was that kind of person who just was he was a people person. He cared about people. He nurtured new talent. And there's people with stories that far surpass mine in terms of what he did to help them launch their careers. But every time I had a request or a favor or a, hey, Stuart, what do you think of this? You know, and run something by him, he was always just right there, and he never asked for anything. And he was just such a warm spirit, and he'll be sorely missed. Wes Craven is another one. I mean, I can't, again, imagine that we would have been able to do Never Sleep Again. I'm getting emotional without Wes. And he later helped us. We did a documentary on Scream, on the original Scream for BioChannel. And Wes just was right there. You know, he didn't ask for anything. He didn't get paid. He didn't want a piece of the profits. He wasn't that kind of person. He was like Wes, who cared about the fans. He cared about young filmmakers. He cared about letting the story be told so it would live on. It's hard to watch the end of Never Sleep Again for me to this day, because one of the things he says in his wrap up is, you know, I think what it'll say on my grave is, you know, the man who created Freddy. You know? So it's, you know, now watching it, it's tinged with a lot of sadness. Just a terrible loss. And, you know, and he gave a lot, and those are my memories of those two people in particular, is that, you know, they had these great careers. They flourished in their time, but they also paid it forward a lot. You know, I think Kevin Williamson owes his career in a large measure to Wes, you know, for getting behind the Scream franchise. And not that Kevin didn't have the talent, he did, but Wes saw it. So yeah, those are the things that I remember. One third one I have to mention is Deborah Hill, the producer and writer of Halloween, who wasn't involved as a producer in the franchise, but took the time when I got hired to do Halloween 6 to call me and say, hey, congratulations, I heard you got this. I knew you wanted this for a long time, because she kind of knew me. And I just want you to know, I hope you do a great job so that they can do 7, 8, 9, 10, and she just took the time to do that, and she didn't have to. So, people talk about Hollywood as being this sort of cutthroat industry, but I have to say, there are a lot of people who are just very supportive. And without those people, I wouldn't have had the opportunities that I've had.
So I got to say, you've had a wonderful career through Hollywood, especially having talked and been involved with so many people involved in so many franchises over the years. So I got to say thank you from me and the Twig crew for joining us today on the show. Are there any projects coming up from you that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Given the state of the world, sadly, let's all hunker down and stay inside like we're supposed to right now. There are some things that I've been working on and that we're supposed to go that I don't know that I can talk about just yet, but we will see how things play out once this whole thing ends. I was supposed to direct another film this summer, and it's based on a real serial killer that's very terrifying. And so that is, in the works. But and then there's a TV series that I've been pitching based on Amityville, actually, that I've been involved with that for quite some time. So that's kind of in the works as well. So to stay tuned, because, obviously depending on what happens with this virus that's taken hold of the world, and I think we're going to see a lot more movies that have to do with human survival after this.
Yeah, we can look forward to yet another wave of post-apocalyptic dystopian future.
Well, I don't even know about that. I hope that people are, I'm sure every writer in Hollywood is just, hunkering down and writing those spec scripts right now. But I hope that the stories have to do with, fighting that monstrous evil, as opposed to, the world is ended and we're all screwed. I think there's something about finding strength in yourself and in your community that's important. Those stories are important too right now.
Well, we can most certainly hope that the future does look a little bit brighter as we look forward.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, guys, that was my interview with Daniel Farrands. So, like I said, be sure to check out his stuff. If you want to find out more about him, go look on IMDb. You can find his full filmography on there. I highly recommend his documentaries. He did have a couple movies in the last couple of years. Again, you can find those on Amazon Prime, I think, or Netflix. So just look around. You can find his stuff. I really do recommend him. So we will be talking to him, preferably not in 10 years.
Let's hope not. Let's do that much sooner than 10 years.
Absolutely. So, guys, that is going to do it for us here on This Week in Geek. So for Twig, I've been Mike the Birdman Dodd saying, live free or die hard. And as my friend Jackie Bam Bam might say, be cool, be kind, be careful. We'll catch you guys next time right here on ThisWeekInGeek.net.
Well, that's our show. All right, here's the deal. Every time you watch my show, I will send you $40.
Checks will not be honored.
You've been listening to This Week in Geek, your source for guaranteed nonsense or your money back. Tune in next week for more info on the most important things you didn't need to know. Check out our website at ThisWeekInGeek.net and subscribe to our podcast through iTunes or any podcatcher. If you'd like to comment on this episode, head over to this episode's post at ThisWeekInGeek.net and leave a comment through Facebook Connect. Follow us on Twitter at ThisWeekInGeek.net and follow our Instagram at twig_official_podcast. Social media not your thing? Send us an email at feedback@ThisWeekInGeek.net. We'll see you next time, and remember,
lower your shields and surrender your listenership.
Just when you think this show is terrible, something wonderful happens.
What?
It ends.
I have to go. Somewhere there is a crime happening.